that we are a historically Black, community-based institution who serve all Easton marginalized children and families. And it's such a pleasure for me to be here for our first series that we're having. And this is pretty much like an inauguration because we are right down the road. And if you haven't seen, we have a brand new building that's there that's coming up. And so this is our first inauguration. Yes, it's okay to clap. Yeah. This is our first session of minis that we'll be having to the upcoming official opening of our building that will be this summer. But I'm here because we are going to have a wonderful talk with our pastor that's here, Pastor Reverend Minister Tisha Williams, and she is the pastor here at the First Baptist Church of Bridgehampton, and she also is a board member here for the center at the Bridgehampton Child Care and Recreational Center. She is on our board as well, but she's a phenomenal woman. You'll see that when she gets up here and she does the interview with Mark Torres, but she is someone that I'm going to use the phrase that she connects, she directs, she protects, and she is just a diamond that has been added to this community, and she is my friend. And I want to say that she has many things that she does. She is an influencer. She is a person that sets the example, and she is always positive with a smile on her face. And I just love her. And thank you, First Baptist, for opening up your doors for this session because you are a part of the center as well, and you all are a part of the center family and legacy. So I thought it would be befitting to have this discussion, our first discussion at our Thinking For It lecture series here, and I look forward to it. I hope you all enjoy it. And without further ado, Reverend Tish Williams.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to do it one more time. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. While we are doing a community event, I'm going to remind you that you're in a Baptist church, and so if you don't speak back, we think something's wrong. It's a call and response kind of space here. We are so happy to have you. I certainly want to thank Bonnie Cannon and everyone from the Bridgehampton Child Care and Recreation Center, the center, for allowing us the privilege to share with all of you today. What Bonnie told you was our mission statement. We are First Baptist, connecting, directing, and protecting. And this is one of the elements, one of the three. We are connecting today. And I think by the end of this, we will also be protecting. In a way, we are protecting the history and preserving the history of our community. And so when we think about what we're talking about today, I'm super excited to have the author Mark Torres here. I can't wait to introduce you to him. Introduce you guys to him. I've had the pleasure of speaking with him and reading from his book, and you guys are in for a real treat. But one of the things that I want to say is when we think about the Hamptons, you take that drive down 27 and your heart starts to race. You get really excited around about the end as you come into the community, into Southampton, West Hampton, Southampton, Bridgehampton, East Hampton, Amagansett, all the way to Montauk. We think about this as a haven. We think about the Hamptons as the heart of Suffolk County, happiness and joy. But what we never consider is the horrors of the Hamptons. But today, I hope that we can move from a place of examining the horror to a place of healing and a place of hope. That is the goal of the conversation and the presentation today. And so with that, I want to introduce you to our guest, our lecturer, our author, an amazing man, Mark Torres, who's going to take us down this trip, who's going to take us down memory lane and expose us to a history that most people are not aware of in the Hamptons. And so with that, I'm going to ask that you would do a couple of things, just housekeeping. You make sure your phones are on vibrate or mute so that we don't interrupt his wonderful presentation. And I'm also going to ask that you would go to our YouTube page, the First Baptist Church of Bridgehampton. You can share that link. We have people on with us live right now. And so if you would share that link, we can get this wonderful presentation and this wonderful event out to the whole community, which is the goal. And so with that, the man, the author, the wonderful scholar that we have with us today, Mark Torres.
Thank you, Reverend Tish. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Let me just start briefly by saying I've given quite a few of these lectures, probably over 24 lectures, and without a doubt, I could say this is the most special. There are a few shining good stories that come out of the history of my book, and I'm glad to say that this is one of them. The formation of the center from a terrible tragedy, and here we are 72 years later, a new building broke ground, and a long-lasting history, and I'm just honored to be a small part of it and help the center discover its roots. So without further ado, I'd like to start the presentation, but I'd like to open up with a story that pretty much led us here to where we are today. Beginning in 1943, New York State authorized Suffolk County to begin using mobile labor camps to house the thousands of migrant laborers that would come to this county each year to harvest the vast potato farms and other crops in this area. Over the years, conditions at these camps would fall into disrepair, creating very dangerous situations. Anderson Jenkins and his wife, Willie Mae Jenkins, were two migrant farm workers from New Jersey. They traveled to the Bridgehampton, probably a mile or so from this exact location, each year to work on the farms in Bridgehampton. They inhabited a one-room, 14 by 18-foot chicken coop with their 11 children near a cluster of other rundown shacks on Bridgehampton Sag Harbor Road, about 1.5 miles north of the village of Bridgehampton. The area was locally known as Tobacco Road or the Bottoms. Just past midnight on October 22nd, 1950, a young migrant worker named Martin Naples visited the shack to see a woman named Miss Berlene Burns, the sister of Miss Jenkins, who was staying with the family. An altercation ensued between the two, and a kerosene oil stove, which stood near the only door of the shack, overturned, and the place was immediately engulfed with flames. Without hesitating, Mrs. Jenkins shattered a nearby window with her bare hands and tossed out their 7-month-old twin children out of the window before assisting others to safety. Unfortunately, they were unable to save their daughter, Katie Lou Jenkins, 3 years old and 6 months, and their youngest son, Walter Jenkins, 1 year old and 10 months, who were sleeping in a bed furthest away from the windows. Mrs. Jenkins severed an artery when breaking the window. Six others sustained cuts and burns from the fire, including 4 of the children, ranging from 11 to 5 years old. In the wake of this terrible tragedy, the Bridgehampton community rallied to devise a way to protect the children of migrant workers and others in the area. Dr. Binga Dismond, a prominent doctor from Sag Harbor, rented a nearby house for a small fee to be used as a child care center. 2 years later, Mrs. Charles F. Brush purchased a 6.5-acre property and donated it to what became the Bridgehampton Child Care Center and Recreational Center to care for migrant children and others in need in the community. A local advertisement on the center's opening read, the people of Bridgehampton feel that this project will be a big step towards improving the deplorable conditions of the migrant laborer, which is a shameful problem in our country in this day of a higher standard of living for the American worker. Area artists held shows on the beach called Arts on the Dunes to raise money for the center. Toy drives, music festivals, and other events were also held. A federal grant helped support literacy programs, daycare center, youth development programs, and recreational activities. For more than 72 years, the center has been serving the community, and even though it came from a terrible tragedy, it is one of the few beacons of good news found in the history covered in my book. And I thank you for that, to the community and the center. And if I may be so, can we take a moment of silence in honor of Katie Lou Jenkins, Walter Jenkins, and so many other men and women and children who needlessly perished in this dark history of Long Island. Thank you. So Eddie, if we could begin the program, the screen. So we're here to discuss my book, Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood, which was released on March 22nd of last year, which seems like a lifetime ago, but continuously doing these events to share this important history. Next slide, please. It's important to point out that this topic really was nearly forgotten, almost lost history. And many points are important to identify for the purpose of this presentation and the book. Is to identify the camps in Suffolk County, to discuss the inhabitants and the living conditions of those at the camps, to identify those outspoken critics of the migratory labor system, and to discuss what caused an end to this era of the labor camps. Next slide, please. Because there was no primary sources, I had to rely on good old-fashioned investigative research. I reviewed over 300 newspaper articles, several red documentaries I had to review and study, as well as numerous interviews with people from all kinds, whether migrant laborers, farmers, people in the government, and all types of documents and government data I was able to retrieve, and also special help and thanks from libraries and historical societies. Next slide, please. So this story, to understand this story, and I'll be brief, to give you a basic understanding of farming in the community. 19th century immigrants brought with them the skills of growing potatoes. By 1850, nearly all of the farms on the east end of Long Island grew potatoes, cauliflower, and several other crops as well. By 1943, over 50,000 acres of potatoes and 13,000 acres of other crops were grown in the area. And by 1949, the county alone produced between 14 million and 18 million bushels of potatoes. Staggering amount. And also, a fully developed industry had begun at the time, led by the Suffolk County Farm Bureau. Next slide, please. With so much crop, there was always a high demand for labor. And World War II created a nationwide shortage of laborers. So the government decided to intervene and create programs to help area farmers throughout the country fill that need. This created three distinct migrant streams: the West Coast, which produced the majority of the nation's vegetables; the Midwest, from Texas to Canada, produced the majority of the nation's wheat; and the East Coast, from Florida to Maine, which produced a variety of crops. This book focused exclusively on the East Coast migrant stream. Next slide, please. Suffolk County itself had, again, a shortage of approximately 2,700 farm laborers, which may not sound like a lot, but it was a lot for this geographical area. And many things were devised and plans were hatched to try to solve this. German POWs from Camp Upton were used. Chinese American immigrants from New York City, Boy Scouts, local high school students, even Polish immigrants from the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. But these were all Band-Aid approaches. It was a short-lived program, and eventually, after the war ended, World War II ended, the government winded down the program, and the local farmers were then left to fend for themselves to try to find this, to fill this shortage. Next slide, please. Here you see some photos of the vast farms, which just drive down the road, you'll see. They were potato farms and other crops, endless. Next slide, please. And I could tell you from doing this research, I have such a profound respect for those in farm labor. I had no indication of how hard and backbreaking work it is. They're out in the fields, they're working relentless sun, weather, elements, and you see the workers bending, crawling. They call this stoop labor for obvious reasons, bending, crawling, kneeling, very taxing on the body. Next slide, please. And you see, again, the vast, here's some old photograph of the machinery and the potatoes on the ground to be retrieved. Next slide, please. I won't bore you here with this. I'm a lawyer by trade. I know there was another lawyer in the audience, but I could tell you, just for importance, that almost every worker in this country has federal protection under the National Labor Relations Act. And I say almost. Almost, who was excluded? Farm laborers. Both then and as of this very moment, farm laborers in this country are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, which led to them being extremely vulnerable and to the terrible conditions that you will soon learn about. Next slide, please. With the thousands of laborers entering the state, New York State had to devise a way to house these workers. Suffolk County and upstate counties were selected by the state to erect and use labor camps. Various labor camps are created to, create proper and enforce proper living conditions at the camps. Next slide, please. In 1943, the first of 4 government-sponsored camps opened up. They were located in Peconic, Greenport, Kings Park, and Port Jefferson. By 1951, there were 28 registered labor camps in the county. And by 1958, there were 134 registered labor camps, a tremendous spike in a short period of time. By 1960, it dwindled to 120, and then over the next few decades, the camps continued to decline for reasons I'll discuss. Today, there are still migrant labor camps, vastly different than the era covered in my book. We're far more regulated, different times, certainly, but there are still some labor camps. Next slide. So what is a labor camp? People often ask. The term itself is used interchangeably. Simply enough, it's a physical structure used to house migrant laborers. It could have been a house, a barn. In one case in Greenport, an historic mansion was used, rundown shacks. Whatever could have or would have passed muster, at least initially, would have been considered a labor camp. Next slide, please. The conditions at the camps were always in terrible, poor condition. They always took on a prison-like atmosphere. They were dangerous. There was little to no privacy, unsanitary, terrible conditions throughout, and generally there was little public sympathy because many of these workers were seen as outsiders, out of sight, out of mind. Next slide, please. The first migrant labor camp was known as the Lake Lodge Labor Camp in Peconic, New York. In 1943, it opened. The U.S. government contracted with the island of Jamaica to bring in 100 farm laborers. These workers traveled from Jamaica by train to New Orleans and took the long train ride to Long Island, and the U.S. government paid those travel expenses. These workers were lauded for their tireless work ethic and production. They had extensive experience from working on the plantations back home. They were paid approximately 40 cents per hour. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of the Lake Lodge Labor Camp, which, as you see, is a 3-story cottage home. It is, I can tell you, it still exists today. It is a private home. I can't tell you where, but I can tell you that it's certainly steeped in history. And this was the first recorded migrant labor camp. Next slide, please. Here you see some workers from the camp. The 3 men on the right were workers from Jamaica. The one on the left was one of the supervisors of the camp. And this was a government-sponsored camp, so generally conditions were better here at the camp. Next slide, please. By far, the largest and most notorious labor camp was known as the Cutjog Labor Camp. It opened in 1944. A group of farmers opened what was called the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative, which is really a company of farmers, local farmers. They purchased the land and built upon the camp, which created army barracks, cabin-style units, tents covering the rooftops. It had the capacity to hold up to 300 workers at any given time. It had the only known school for local children. It had a Dixie Bell Inn restaurant on site and a small store that sold goods to the workers, typically at overinflated prices. Here you see a photograph of the Cutjog Labor Camp. The small girl standing in the center of the road was known as Main Street. All the way in the back on the right was the large barracks where single men would stay in a large open area. known as the cabin style or bunk style sleeping arrangements. Towards the right and left are the cabins with the tents covering, with the rooftops, the tents covering the rooftops. Next slide, please. Here you see a promotional advertisement from the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative promoting their camp. I can tell you that every amenity listed here technically is true, but over the years the camp deteriorated badly and it really became notorious for it. Next slide. Here you see a photograph of Helen Prince in the only known school for a labor camp. This really was a large room, not optimal for learning conditions, and many children really struggled, didn't have proper learning or education throughout really this whole era, which is a sad lost legacy and generation of children. Next slide, please. Here you see inside one of the cabins, notice the dirty bedding, the bare walls. Next slide. And you see the double bunk beds on each side. This would have had the capacity of at least 4 people to stay in this cabin. And again, over the years, it run down. It was featured on a documentary called Harvest of Shame, 1960, Edward R. Murrow. You can find that on YouTube. I'd encourage you, if you have any interest, to look at that documentary to see the sobering conditions of farm workers throughout the country at the time. And again, over the years at this camp, it continued to deteriorate. Bathroom facilities were in poor condition and limited. No privacy, crime, violence was all too common at these camps. And of course, when crowd work is in situations like this, tragedy was bound to strike, and it did. Next slide, please. In 1961, 4 workers were killed in a fire at the Cutchogue Labor Camp. Leroy McCoy and Charles Jordan, James Davis, and a man named James Overstreet all perished in the fire. And the 4 men, the cause of the fire was that the 4 men snuck in a kerosene stove because they could not afford the 75-cent cost of meals at the camp. Extreme poverty led to them taking chances, which sadly took their lives, and quite frankly, it was a miracle more people did not perish that day. Over the years, the camp continued to deteriorate. In 1970, it lost its permit. Eventually, in 1983, the land was sold, and 1 year later, the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative dissolved, almost 40 years in operation. Next slide, please. At the time, the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative also ran what was known as the Greenport Labor Camp. Edwin H. King, a prominent grower from Orient, ran the camp. He eventually leased it to the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative. And this was a quite large camp. It was located at the former mansion, the Dick Conklin Mansion on Route 48 in Greenport, which today, if anyone knows, is where the old where San Simeon Elder Assisting Living is located, that building. That's the site of where this camp was. One notable incident here in 1947, a group of 200 workers from Mexico walked off the job protesting wages. There was a local hearing held at a school. The workers had no representation. The Farm Bureau ruled in favor of the growers. The workers were back to work. Seemingly an isolated situation, but a rare showing of unity amongst foreign workers in this area. This camp was in operation. Here you see the photographs. These are very rare photographs. To the left, you see the facade of the mansion. Again, it was a former mansion. And to the right, the barracks that were built outside of the camp, outside and to the rear of the property. And this camp was in operation for several years until its closure in 1966. Next slide, please. Here is a sketch of the Richard Conklin Mansion when it was in place prior to becoming a labor camp. Next slide, please. Through my research, in 1960, I was able to pinpoint some more precise data. And you see the numbers here. The South Hole Township had 24 camps. Here in Southampton Town, 13 camps with over 250 workers. One noticeable camp here in Bridgehampton was the Henry Jacobs Labor Camp. Mr. Jacobs had an old rundown home, which we used as a labor camp. He was cited many times for deteriorating in terrible, dangerous conditions. Sadly, in 1968, a fire occurred at this home, took the lives of 3 people, including one woman named Myrtle Lee Grant, who was an epileptic and a mute. She sadly died without having to make a sound or screaming for help. Mr. Jacobs was charged for that crime, that fire. However, he had a surgery and operation, and he perished shortly thereafter, and the case was dropped. It was a rare showing of some judicial enforcement of these camps at the time. And camps throughout this area were in many places: Foster Avenue, Cooks Lane, Meacox Lane, the Babinski Labor Camp, the Baldwin Camp, the Carpenter, Roscoe Camps, all different names. The book does have a large index of well over 100 labor camps listed by name and general area location. Here you see a migrant labor camp locator map. Each dot you see on this map contained one or denoted one labor camp in the area. At this time, there were 120 camps registered in the county, and you see on the bottom right where the Southampton Township, where the camps were generally located. Next slide, please. This is some photographs of the Riverhead Labor Camps around 1970. Next slide, please. And you can see they all take on that general appearance, isolation, again, almost prison-like atmosphere. Although workers were free to come and go as they wished, it wasn't so easy. You see the distance here. These camps are always in isolated locations, rural locations, so it wasn't easy to just move about so freely. So isolation and boredom was certainly an important part of my research. These photographs are from the beanery. It's a plant on Shelter Island. They flash froze lima beans and cauliflower and sold them to large companies like Libby's and Birdseye. Next slide. You see some of the workers, mostly from Alabama and the Carolinas. They would come down each year to work at this plant, and they would stay at a labor camp approximately a mile from this location. Next slide. Above all else, this book really is a human story, and it was important for me to isolate those involved in this system, from the workers to the crew leaders, to the growers, the public, Farm Bureau, and the government all had a part to play in this. Next slide, please. Labor camp economics. Here I could sadly say was the greatest travesty of this system. It's basically a cycle of perpetual debt. Everything that the workers, from just staying at the camps to purchasing items, it was always purchased on credit, double the price, and often withdrawn and taken out of their paychecks. And of course, when you have that kind of system, it's rife with abuse and mistreatment. I'll give you an example. There's one woman in Riverhead in 1965 who went to the courts to complain that she was being cheated out of pay. Social Security taxes were being taken from her pay. But she did not even have a Social Security card, a Social Security number. It shows you the kind of indication that the element of fraud that was going on at the time. Housing, food, transportation, all costs were usually taken out, and again, at inflated rates from the workers. People have asked where the title Dust for Blood comes from. In one of the documentaries I've reviewed, the worker explained the hard work that he does for the money that they get, hence the title Dust for Blood. You know, this cycle of debt was crushing. Workers would be recruited from other states, told, come on, you're gonna make good money on Long Island, you're gonna do well for the season, come on up. They get on the bus, get a ride up, come back. They're already on the hook for $30 in debt, $15 ride each way. Money they didn't have on hand, so it would be on credit. If workers broke even at the end of the farming season, they'd be lucky. Most of the time, they were in a cycle of debt. They'd follow the crew leader to the next stop, whether it's upstate New York, back to Florida, and then follow the circuit again and again and again. And one of the critical factors here is there was no pay during work stoppages. So at the time, it was $1.35 an hour for an 8-hour day. That's $10.80. But if the machinery broke down, at no fault of the workers, for 4 hours, the workers were required to stay on site. So they're there for 8 hours, but they're only being paid for 4 hours. In essence, it cut their pay in half. Meanwhile, they're still responsible for the debts they incurred at staying at the camps and food, beverage, and everything else involved. And of course, throughout this whole setting, there was theft, violence, manipulation, and exploitation. I cannot stress enough the exploitation of the crew leaders who perhaps are the most villainous in this history. Many of them came from the same areas where these workers, they were recruited, Alabama, Arkansas. They would recruit these workers, bring them up, and run the camp. And the growers and farmers, they would lease the camp itself to these crew leaders. You run everything. You take over the pay, everything. You do all of that. And all the while, the farmers had the luxury of having these workers on site nearby. They'd drive to the camp, pick some of them up, back to the farms, work the land, drop them off at the camp. So the farmers really subcontracted all responsibility to these crew leaders who were quite notorious. And in doing so, you know, they had to turn their backs to the things, the chronic abuse and deteriorating conditions that were going on around them for years and years and years, all within their own community. I've spoken to several farmers, and they were quick to, and perhaps correctly, blame the crew leaders. But at the same time, I pointed out to them, you knew what was going on. How could you turn your back? They had no answer. They just farmed it out, literally, and enjoyed the labor to really work their farms. So this exploitation, just go back to the other slide, please. Thank you. This exploitation is quite chronic. Several of these crew leaders are notorious. I could think of Carl Beeman, a crew leader from Riverhead and Cutchogue, in the camps. He rode around a rusty red bus. He recruited workers. Sometimes, most of the time is by false promises. Great money on Long Island, you're gonna do well. Other times by force, a term known as Shanghai. He would go to inner cities, homeless shelters, bars. People passed out if they were drinking on the street. Pick them up, put them on the bus, they'd wake up the next day in Cutchogue. It was described by some in the press as a 20th century form of slavery. He's been known to beat workers with a skillet and a stick. On one occasion, he locked a man named Frank Singleton, who had mental disabilities, acknowledged by those who knew him. And he locked Frank Singleton in a room to take care of Beeman, his own sick wife. So while Beeman was forcing this gentleman to take care of his wife while he was out doing whatever he would do. And there were rare accounts of justice, and I say they were rare, but they were noticeable and itemized in the book. James Brown of Mattituck was charged with stealing $400 in wages and running a camp without a license. James Colville was charged with beating workers with the hammer in his fists. And Ernest Mitchell, who also went by the alias of Charlie Sapp, notorious crew leader, who was known to ruthlessly beat men and women, his workers. He had a vicious German Shepherd dog at his side named Duke, and he definitely terrorized terrorized all of the workers, those within his control. And year after year, these unscrupulous people had control. I just want to point out one noticeable incident. Macon, Georgia, a boy named Alfonso Mahone, 15 years old. He was out in the streets. A crew leader came in a bus, and they recruited him and some of his workers. He winded up working out here in Bridgehampton at 2 different locations. While working at a plant, a potato processing plant, he hurt his hand. And he asked for help. They denied him help. He complained he was in pain. They evicted him. They fired him from the plant and evicted him from the camp, left him stranded. He made his way to Riverhead eventually. Was able, through help of a nonprofit, was able to get a ride home. And when he got home, the Department of Labor was able to recoup the monies owed to him. As tragic as that sounds, that's actually a success story, because most of the workers did not have the luxury of getting rides home. They were virtually stranded, and certainly didn't have the luxury of getting their monies back that they worked for. Quite tragic. Next slide. So the book, it wasn't enough for me to detail these camps and say how bad and show how bad they were. I wanted to understand and have the reader understand the effects on the people who stayed at the camps. And what I found was startling. Workers were racked with isolation, boredom. Again, camps are located miles from the nearest town centers. It wasn't just so easy to go into town and have a meal or just some semblance of quality of life. It was little recreation, little family support. And again, because they were seen as outsiders, there was little public sympathy to help. They were stranded in many respects. In 1970, Newsday reporter Les Payne spent a week undercover at a camp in Riverhead. And he wrote extensively about the situations at the camp and also about the alcoholism that was quite chronic at most of these camps, which under these conditions is nearly understandable. He called alcohol the lifeblood of the migrant worker. Next slide, please. Health and safety is also looked at. Low life expectancy, high infant mortality, weather-related maladies, just being out in the elements day after day. Pesticide poisonings were evident. Illnesses, infectious diseases like tuberculosis were chronic. And there was little access to adequate health care that led to death and suffering. 1956, a man named Arthur Drew from Mattituck was found dead alongside the road from pneumonia. 1965, Willie Jeff Lawrence, also in Mattituck. He died after receiving a fractured skull 1 week earlier when he was attacked inside his cabin. So he walked around for a week with a fractured skull, got no treatment, died a week later. James Biddle, 1969, Riverhead. He was found dead of a liver condition the day after he went to the hospital for treatment. He was denied treatment, sent back to the camp. He died in his sleep. 1971, Pedro Fuentes, also Riverhead. He was a known epileptic. He had a seizure and his frozen body was found between two camps in the woods. Safety, again, I mentioned stoop labor. The bending, crawling is very taxing on the body. By 1970, the accident rate for farm work was 3 times higher than any other industry. And by 1980, it was deemed more dangerous than mining. Lost limbs, fingers, toes, or worse was quite common. And prior to 1965, these workers had no access to workman's compensation. So if they sustained an injury, the only way to receive any compensation for it would be to sue in the courts, which without any assistance, it just didn't happen. It's too difficult, too controlling. Next slide, please. Here you see some of the workers working on this equipment. There was no training. It was learned by experience, told by the next worker. Next slide. See, again, see this worker here. At any point, and accidents were detailed in the book, or worse. And next slide. Here you see workers traveling. This was photo was taken in New Jersey, and clearly you see the low railings. If this truck were to take a turn at a certain speed, many or all of these workers easily would have toppled over to injury or death. And there were quite a few incidents, both locally and nationally, traveling from Florida or other states to Long Island. The book details many sad accidents that occurred. Next slide. And when you cram people in dangerous slum-like conditions and exploit them physically and economically, crime and violence are natural results. And the book covers many examples: beatings, attacks, all types of crime that went on. I could tell you in 1955, a man in Cutjog labor camp stabbed another man in the heart. There was an altercation. He fled to the nearby woods. He was arrested, found with the knife. He pled guilty, but apparently there were no charges because it was seen as self-defense. And eventually the man got off the hook. That man became known as the blues artist known as Son House, a well-known blues artist that was trapped in this system at one point and involved in this. And the attacks occurred, the levels of crime and violence wasn't just within the camps, it was between the camps and also throughout the surrounding communities. There were many incidents of calamities that happened. During my research, I had the pleasure of interviewing Joseph Grattan. He was the Riverhead police chief at the time in the 60s. Took me on a tour, showed me around with my son, and back then, of course, there were no cell phones, there were call boxes. And he explained quite clearly, if there were no call boxes, you had 2 options: either talk your way out of trouble or fight your way out of trouble. It's quite alarming for the Riverhead police chief to make that statement, but that's the way it was at the time. Next slide, please. And also the effects on the economy as well is detailed in the book. The calamities, the fires, the crime, the violence, all of this had effects on the first responders, the medical hospitals, everyone involved. The book details Riverhead. It's quite a fascinating part of the story because many of the workers, when they said they're not going to travel from Florida or Jersey, we're going to stay on Long Island, most of them did so in Riverhead. 60% of the camps were located in Riverhead, and 70% of the workers were generally located in the Riverhead area. So Riverhead certainly factors into an important part of this history. Next slide, please. Here you see a rundown shack. This was once used by migrant laborers in Riverhead of an area known as the Bottoms. Next slide, please. This building here was taken, it's in Santa Mauritius in 1920. But this was common during the duck farm industry. Riverhead and most areas on East End of Long Island were very well known for the duck industry. Next slide, please. This building the building like this is called the Duck Brooder building. They house thousands and thousands of duck hatchlings each year on well over 100 duck farms throughout the East End of Long Island. When the duck industry winded down towards the late 60s for environmental reasons, farmers, particularly Hollis Warner from the Riverhead, who owned the largest duck farm in the nation, would take these buildings and convert them into rentable spaces to migrant workers. He would simply partition off from the pole to the wall and just rent them out to migrant workers. Terrible conditions, no running water, virtually isolated in what is now known as Indian Island State Park. Well over 500 acres this one man owned, and when you have conditions like this, and the reason why you had conditions like this was because there was no housing code. And without a housing code, anyone could put up any structure and call it a home. Sadly, that had terrible consequences, as you'll soon see. Next slide, please. Many men, women, and children perished in this era of the labor camps. Negligence, poverty, misfortune were all the reasons. Dangerous camps, owners cut corners, poverty led workers to cut corners and take chances, other misfortunes. And I took it a great mission to identify as many of these forgotten souls and name them in the book. Of course, we mentioned Katie Lou Jenkins and Walter, 1950. And again, that was one of the few bright and shining spots of this history. That directly led to the center, which has done so many great work for almost 75 years. But it wasn't always the case. In January 1959, in Riverhead alone, there were 8 deaths in 11 days, all by fire. I think of Dilcia Trent, 22-year-old mother. Her husband was a migrant worker working in the fields. It was a cold January day. She was living in a one-room shack with her 3 children, all under the age of 3 years old. It was a cold day. She wanted to light the kerosene stove to get some heat. When she lit the match, the match fell onto the floor. The rug was saturated with kerosene, started to go in flames. In a panic, she attempted to roll up the rug to take it out of the structure. Unfortunately, she knocked over the kerosene, 80-pound kerosene heater. She went to pick that up. She got kerosene on her clothes. She was immediately engulfed in flames. So she has the dilemma, an agony and pain, to leave her children there screaming in the bed or run outside to try to douse the flames in the mud. She chose the latter. Within seconds, the place was engulfed. The 3 children perished. She eventually doused the flames but had suffered burns on 80% of her body. She died 2 weeks later. And I remember doing research for this book in the Riverhead Cemetery, crawling on my hands and knees looking for a stone, some kind of semblance that this person existed other than these newspaper articles. And sadly, I couldn't find it. So wherever I go, I tell a story of Dilcia Trent, the tragedy of her and her children. And so many others like it. I mentioned the 1961 Cutchogue fire. 4 men, Overstreet, Davis, Jordan, and McCoy. They died. They couldn't afford 75-cent cost of meals. They took a chance, took their lives. The Jacobs Labor Camp fire in 1968, Myrtle Lee Grant and 2 others perished. And so many others detailed in the book that, again, were just astonishing, frightening, and all the more important to tell and share in this history. Next slide, please. Next slide as well. It was also important to point out the advocacy, the enforcement, and the judicial process in this book. I mentioned the wonderful story here, the center, which again, I'm quite moved as I speak now of all the good they've done from that tragedy. And there were others. Reverend Arthur Bryant from Greenport, a local reverend who's a strong advocate for migrant workers. I wish I met him. I could say I'm friends with his daughters now, and they were thrilled when I learned I was writing of this story. And he testified before Congress in 1969. He appeared in television and radio programs. And for all his efforts, and despite being a man of faith, he received death threats for his advocacy for migrant workers. But undeterred, he continued on. Mary Chase Stone, a woman of a life of luxury in the New England area, left that to come and settle in Riverhead and form a nonprofit group. And she formed Long Island Volunteers, an amazing program that helped many migrant workers, including the boy I mentioned before, Alfonso Mahone. She helped him get home, helped him get his money recouped, and did so many other things for so many other people. Clergy was important, social groups were important, health department inspectors were important. They too faced threats, violence, just for simply enforcing the law. Next slide, please. I wish I could tell you that there was a public push, like there was in California, to have better rights and working conditions for these workers that somehow would have brought this to an end, but sadly it didn't. What ended this era was a change in agriculture and farming. More machinery was used, less workers were needed, thus less camps were needed. And also the potato production declined. 1954, 45,000 acres are planted, By 1997, less than 6,000 acres. Dramatic decline. At the same time, as we all know, the land values grew exponentially. So farmers were really sitting on these incredibly profitable lands and facing their own struggles, simply cashed out. They sold their lands. By 1971, 2/3 of the land of the farms were owned by prospectors. And eventually they sold those to what became the vineyard owners and others who own the large swaths of land that we see today. As far as the historical legacy, I'll leave that to the reader to decide when they read the book. And I hope you all read the book and have the opportunity to understand it. But for my purpose, I will simply say that this was another sad example where industry was valued far greater than human life. And it's a terrible consequence. And last slide, please. I can say with some joy, certainly great joy, in January of 2020, New York State finally passed a local labor law to protect farm workers. And it provided wages and overtime protection, other protections for workers. And in September of 2021, a small group of farm workers in Pindar Vineyards in Peconic formed the union, joined the union. They're the first workers in New York State to do so as agricultural farm workers. And strangely enough, that was in Peconic, where 78 years prior was the first registered labor camp. So if there is a bright news and hopeful turnaround of this sad legacy, that is one of them. So thank you very much for your time.
Fascinating. Can we give Mark another round of applause? And so I want to just lead us in some guiding questions, and then we're going to open up. There's a center mic here, and we'll open up for a Q&A for any questions you all might have. I know that I have several notes. I had notes before, but now actually hearing you give the presentation, I have even more notes. So I want to start here so we can get to know a little bit about you. So let's start with a light question. So I believe that all readers are not leaders, but I believe that all leaders are readers. And so while you are an author, what are you reading? Well, we want everyone to read your book. What are you reading?
Well, my day job, I'm a lawyer. So I read contracts. I read letters. But they all have things of purpose and meaning. You know, one of the joys, the true joy I have from my work is that I represent others and their families and their livelihoods. So when I'm working on their behalf, it's great fulfillment to secure their livelihoods. Sometimes we have health fairs and the members bring their children, and I see the joy knowing that in some small way I'm able to help their parents have a livelihood and then the whole family have a livelihood, and that's a great importance. For pleasure, ever since leaving law school, it's hard for me to read for pleasure. I guess the pleasure I get derived from is researching for my work, my next project, and it's always historically based. So it's kind of a hodgepodge because I'm still determining what that next book will be, and I'm narrowing it down. But it's usually geared towards the next project, historically based.
It sounds a lot like being a pastor, too. I read a lot for my work. And so speaking of reading and writing, you're also a criminal novelist, a crime novelist. You write mysteries and crime novels. Why the shift in genre? What made you write this book?
Well, going back to my first book, I guess as a lawyer, aside from reading, you do a lot of writing. In fact, most of lawyering is writing, persuading, influencing. And I wanted to write something more. I wanted to write something with that talent and ability in an entertaining fashion. So I spoke with my wife and I said, God, I'd love to write a book. I don't know what. Just think of a story. It couldn't be autobiographical because who would care if my books read about me? So we came up with a story, Stirring in the North Fork. It's a crime novel based on a character, Savoy Graves, who's loosely based on myself, albeit fictional. And he, much like this new book, he uncovers a story that was untold, that of a death of a woman. It seemed suspicious, and no one followed through. And he had the wherewithal to follow through because he cared enough. And I think that that's really the overarching measure, to care enough in your work to tell a story of importance. So even though it was a fictional book, it was for entertainment, it did have those values there. And leading up to that, and in fact, when I wrote that book, I learned of the labor camps then. And I said, this is some important history. I'm going to get back to this. And what I didn't know at the time was how little or really nothing was written about the camps. Then it became a mission. It became a mission to understand why it wasn't told and that it had to be told.
And tell us about your children's book. He also is an author of a children's book. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes, I wrote a children's book called Good Guy Jake. It's a children's book, beautifully illustrated. It tells the story of what labor unions do. Far too often, a lot of unions, they have this kind of dry manuals, outdated stuff. They needed something new. And it was important to impart on our young children from really all grade levels to understand what unions do. And when that book was released, I had the good pleasure of going to my daughter's class. It was in 5th grade at the time. And I read the book to them. And then when I finished and they clapped and they talked, I said, what did you guys get from that? What did you think, would Jake have gotten the job if he wasn't part of a union? And they all said no. And that was important to me, that the children could understand through a story what unions do, the importance of our work. And that was the goal for that.
That's fantastic. Can tell us the title one more time?
Good Guy Jake.
Good Guy Jake. So we want to get that book as
Thank you.
well as your other crime novels. So I just want to shift a little bit to something that I found very interesting. So May was Mental Health Month. And one of the things I think that resonated with me in your book and in the presentation is that you took a moment, you took the time to highlight the emotional and mental conditions or the effects of being a migrant labor worker. And you said, so I'm thinking as we look to the modern day context and the need for mental health care, how much more would you say they needed that in that era?
It was virtually non-existent. I mean, even basic health care was virtually non-existent. There were some efforts. The book does highlight some efforts by the county, who, for instance, they would do large tuberculosis x-ray exams, a whole program for hundreds and hundreds of workers at a cost to the county. It didn't come cheap, but they felt, obviously in the era of COVID, they felt it was important, you think about transmittable diseases, to contain that and treat that. But I found no examples of mental health treatment, very few examples of medical treatment overall. How important it was, absolutely critical. I was really struck by the suffering, mental suffering that these workers had, the isolation, the boredom, 6 to 8 weeks or more at a time, or certainly throughout maybe half a season, away from their families, or just being in these settings where you're alone. And really is understandable to some degree how they can turn to alcoholism and dependency to kind of just pass the time.
Yeah.
Quite tragic.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is some could argue that we still suffer those things today. Well, we are not migrant workers. How many of us often go to work stressed out and leave even more stressed out and turn to substances that will help us anesthetize and feel a little bit better, even just for a moment. We turn to harmful behaviors in order to feel better about what we do for a living. And I say that to say that while this happened 70 plus years ago, a lot of the things that you talked about and itemized and talk about in your book, we're still dealing with it today, perhaps in a different context, in a different way, but we're all still feeling the effects of a lot of the things that happened 70 years ago in our modern day context. I want to ask this question. Of course, I was intrigued by the clergy getting involved. I want to ask you, how can not just clergy, but community leaders, community members, how do we become what you call good angels, or Better Angels? In the epilogue of his book, it's called Better Angels, where he takes a moment to highlight those who put their shoulder to the wheel to improve the conditions at great risk to themselves, So what can we all do in this room, even now, to be better angels as we look toward labor justice?
And on the way driving, I was talking to my daughter and saying, obviously everyone wants to do good and be good. But it's not enough to just stay at that level. You sometimes, and most of the times, have to go to the extra mile. Bridgehampton, the center, is the perfect example of that. The community rallied, the clergy rallied, and it was a wonderful example that still exists today. But there were others who was more isolated, where those within the community, and we have to remember, in fairness, these were farming communities. They made their money, their existence, their livelihoods on farming. There was a farm shortage, there was a labor shortage, and there were tremendous crops. So there was a lot of pressure all the way around. But these constituents, the people in the community, and eventually, initially, they had resistance to these camps, although largely on racial animus and gross grounds. But eventually that waned because they realized somebody had to pick the crops, something had to get done. And you know, the book does point out that the public at large did turn their back. The farmers turned their back, the government turned their back. And I think that there has to be voices to speak out against those turning their back, whether it's shaming them to turn the other way and help, or inspiring them to help. And you know, the few examples I pointed out, and I wish there were more, and they may very well have been, but the ones I found were inspiring and helpful, but certainly much more was needed. And much more is always needed. Whatever time, whatever era, wherever we are, much more is always needed.
Much more is always needed. I like that. Just to give you all some perspective, I did a search. So you said 40 cents per hour.
At that time, yes.
At that time. So that translates to 40 cents per hour each day would be the equivalent of almost $5 today, which would be about, what, $40 a week? Like, yeah, which would be like $2,400 a year today. How many of us could live on $2,400 for the year? I mean, if you just leave your house, it's $100 easily, right? If you leave your house in the Hamptons, it's $200 easily.
But remember, and the difficulty these workers faced is that the constant cheating. And I'll give you another example that I wanted to mention. Many of the workers turned to alcohol, and one of the bottles they drank was Twister, it was called. At the local store, it would cost 61 cents. If you're 3 or 4 miles from the store, you're not going to go to the store and get it, right? At the camp, they'll sell it for $1.20. Wow. And since you have the money, you buy it on credit, and all of this amounts. So the money you mentioned, as low as that is, if the workers broke even, they're lucky. Most of them remain in debt and would follow the crew leader to the next location with that debt. Wow. So even as bad as that is, it's even worse, sadly.
That's fascinating. And I did want to take a moment just to parenthetically pause here. You spoke a great deal about fires, and there was a terrible fire last night in our community where 3 houses were affected by a major fire last night here in the Bridgehampton community. 4, is it 4? Thank you. And so please let us keep those families in our prayers, and we will certainly rally as a church and as a community to see how we can support them, but please keep them in your prayers. And lastly, before we open it up for Q&A, and so if you have your questions ready, you'll be able to present in a few moments. I love, and I certainly want to highlight and commend you for telling the story. There is an African proverb that says, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. Thank you for telling the lion's story and sharing this history of our community. And so I wanted to ask, though I know I've heard the stories of the migrant camps and certainly how the center came into being, but I heard when you mentioned a name, someone I think said they know that person, or I want to know, were there any names that are familiar to you in your families? Yes, could you raise your hand? Yes, so you actually have people here who are familiar with the names and familiar with the history. And I'd likely say, especially in this church, and I'm sure in some of the African-American churches here, there are descendants of the migrant workers who are here. Did you?
When you spoke of the fire when the 2 children were burned, about 5 years later, we all lived in Tuckahoe, and my father bought that property, and we lived on that property, and it was called a hole that went back there where those shanties were, and that's where the children were burned.
I believe it was the old white farm, you know, and again, the history was quite difficult to find on that. So maybe afterwards we'll have a little more talk. I'd love to pick your brain. And one of the things I enjoy about these events is that people have familiarity with the topics. It inspires future questions and thoughts. And for instance, the center is a case in point. After the book was released, I was contacted by the center to see if I can identify the children. At the time the book is released, in the book, the children are not listed. I was happy to take upon that extra research and find out that information and share it to help the center understand its roots. And, you know, it's just further learning is really what it's all about. Is if we fail to really learn, then we're really all in trouble. That's
Right.
the goal, to kind of promote, stimulate learning.
Thank you also for saying their names and honoring them in that way. Again, it's a poem. As long as you say my name, I'll be alive forever. And so we honor them. We say their names.
I just say this too, now, is where that happened is where the CD Museum is.
Where I hear what she said with it.
The CD Museum, the Children's
Oh, the CB
Oh,
Museum.
oh.
Yes, she said
where it happened.
where it happened.
I'd love to talk to you afterwards to get an address. Just to see it would be a lot for me to understand it.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. That's our Deaconess Pinckney. And so we are going to open up for a Q&A now for anyone that may have a question or comment. I'm going to ask that you would step to this mic here in the center so that we might be able to hear you. Yes. So that we might be able to hear you. If it's
This
in,
isn't really a question. I worked as an outreach worker in the migrant camps. It went until 1987. I worked in the camps in Riverhead and the two that were in Sagaponic. From 1967, it was November of 67 to June of 66 to, I mean, of 86, I'm sorry, of 86 to 87 in June. And it was an agency through Riverhead called Rural Opportunities. And I cannot begin to tell you, if it even brings tears to my eyes, I can't believe I'm doing this. This was 35 years ago. I had no idea. I was a flight attendant. The airline closed. I went to apply for a job, and I had to go to the unemployment office downtown Riverhead. And like a lot of people, thought, I want to help people. So they sent me to the unemployment office. And she said, well, we have a job as an outreach worker in the migrant camps. What's a migrant camp? I'll tell you. The crew chiefs, Red, Graveyard, Willie. Willie used to beat people to a pulp by the railroad tracks in Bridgehampton when they were supposed to go down to the Eastern Shore in Virginia in May. They had I just know the street names. I don't want to too much. I don't know many of the formal names. But they had a woman, her street name was Ruby Begonia, and they used to send her into the soup kitchens in Manhattan, and they'd bring them out here. I sneaked, when I think back, I did this. It was to get them out and to bring them to a welding program upstate in Albany. So I was talking to the guys, you know, and I'll get you out. These guys were so smart. I figured out, I sneaked them out, like slavery in 1987. 4 suitcases. I went down like 2 weeks in a row. I said, I swear to you, you can't tell a soul, not another guy. I met them at 3:30 in the morning behind a barn. I can't believe I did this. And put the guys in the suitcase, raced to Riverhead. My office was downstairs. I made them go flying upstairs, and I hid them in the closet. Wow. And at 8 o'clock, Graveyard was pounding on the door. You stole my men. I mean, it's like, God almighty. It was incredible. I had my car parked downtown Riverhead one day, I had a convertible. I came out, I knew it was Red, and unfortunately Red he was a crew chief too, but he didn't want to do what he did. I heard 3 years later that he hung himself. But I had a plastic skeleton hanging from my rearview mirror, and I had a convertible. I drive the convertible up to Farmers Exchange. I go driving up with the skeleton swinging in the breeze, and the guys were all sitting on the seats in the front. They were hysterical, and from that day on, I could have done anything. Wow. But it was amazing. I'm sorry, I didn't ask a question.
no, that's fantastic.
Thank you for what you've done. You would have been one of the better angels.
I was going to say, thank you for being a better
And
angel.
my sister, say what you did. To my nieces and nephews.
No, come,
Yes.
so we can hear you, yeah.
Catholic Charities in Bridgehampton for many years had a wonderful lunch program.
Is it on? Just make sure.
I don't know how it works. It's working now? It's working now? Yes, Catholic Charities on Main Street in Bridgehampton had a lunch program for the camp that was in Sagaponic by that wooden overpass. And every day, the crew chief would bring, the workers there. They were usually men. Many of them at that time in the 80s were young men who the crew chiefs would pick up in Baltimore and Philadelphia who were homeless down there. And as you said, get them in the system and they'd be owing him money. But my two young children, my daughter was 6 weeks the first time she went to the soup program with me. And I can't say how wonderful everyone was. My children used to go trick-or-treating down at the camp, and the conditions were deplorable. They really were. But the people, the warmth in their hearts, I never saw a trace of violence ever. And I could cry too just thinking about it and thinking how wonderful the Bridgehampton Daycare Center has been to this community. It just warms my heart. There sure are a lot of good angels.
Thank you.
As late as 1980, there were sections within a few hundred yards of this church where there were homes that were little more than these cabins, sitting on cinder blocks, outhouses, no electricity, no running water. I remember that a town supervisor named Marty Lang headed up new laws that required that these be torn down. One group of them was on Sag Harbor Turnpike at Narrow Lane on the northeast corner. That's right within 100 yards of about 5 of them. And I remember them, and often as I drive by, now there's new homes there. I mean, relatively new. But there were a number of locations. There were also some on the tracks just in East Hampton near the railroad station. There were some in Bridgehampton, also on Sag Harbor Turnpike and near the railroad station. These were places with little dirt roads, 1980 dirt roads that would go in dead end, and there would be shacks in there. And they were all substandard and had to be torn down, and they were. But this was even more recently than you might imagine. The other thing I wanted to add for you, or all of you, is I opened a business here in Bridgehampton with my office here about 1971. And all during that time, for the next 10 years, on weekends, there would be migrant workers right on Main Street. And they would be downtown here, most of them basking in the sun, looking rather happy to be not working on Sunday, holding paper bags inside of which was Thunderbird wine or something equivalent of that. And I remember thinking at the time rather ridiculously about how happy they looked. That's what I wanted to add.
Thank you.
Wow. I don't know, I have so many emotions just from watching the slideshow and seeing, and hearing and seeing. And my emotions, I'm going to be very honest, my emotions went from sadness to actually being angry, and then also wanting justice, because it seems as though everyone in that scenario actually, got some type of justice. The farmers did, the industry pretty much, it stopped, but there was a new industry that was born. People prospered, but what of the folks that actually were the backbone of building the industry, of toiling the land? And that is just a thing that happens over and over and over again, is that, I'm going to say my people, my black and brown people are the ones that are toiling this land, that are building it up. But people question about reparations, but where are the reparations? And even with that fight of reparations and that fight for reparations, our people are so strong and resilient that we continue on and we continue to be strong and we continue to go on and to make it. And many of the families that you mentioned, you know, the Trents, the Jenkins, are names that, you know, we all know, and there were others that you named, the Browns. But the thing that comes to me as well is to be proud of you know, my heritage, of my legacy, of my people, of the Black race, because regardless that we are strong and that we continue on and that we overcome. So, you know, with that, again, there's several emotions that are going on. And I guess, you know, the other thing that is coming to mind, just here as far as the center is concerned, you know, and how after, you know, 70 years ago, that came together and it's still standing and it's still servicing and doing the things that are needed for the folks in the community. I mean, I believe that was, I couldn't see her because her mask was on. Was that Miss Brenda that was speaking earlier? Yeah, Miss Brenda Pinckney. I mean, she was a former board member of the center, and just how this community and even this church and how the people of this community have strived on, and on the backs of a lot of the ancestors here in this community, others have gone on and have become successes and has created their own businesses, have, you know, done marvelous things. And so it's just a lot of emotions that are going on, and I just I needed to get it all out. But I'm full. I'm really full. And I thank you for, you know, the book. I thank you for the legacy that you've printed, because a lot of times we don't print, we don't talk about our history. And again, that goes to why we need to document and continue to talk and have these talks and document our history and our legacy. So I think that's a lot, but I'll leave it at that.
As the mic is being passed, I just want to submit, I hear your sentiments, certainly, and echo, there's someone right there, and echo your sentiments, Bonnie, but, oh, we're going to come to the front, okay, and echo your sentiments, Bonnie, but I also want to say that I believe the redemption also comes in the work that you're doing at the center now, that the legacies and the lives of those we've named and the nameless does not go in vain, because as you suggested, the center is still here and doing great work and continuing to sow into the seeds of these children so that they might continue to grow and be productive members of society, and that their legacies and their living won't be in vain. So brava to you and to everyone at the center doing such great work.
I just want to say that when I got the invitation for this, I had to come because I am part of the overcomers of migrant workers. My mom had told me the story about the fire. I was one of the children who was taken to the center when it was first established to take care of children whose parents worked on the farms. My parents weren't living on a camp at that time, but they went daily to work picking potatoes, as they would say. And so when I heard this, I said, I have to come and hear more about this story. Life is an interesting circle because I went to the center as a child for care. I worked at the center, first as an aide and then as senior teacher in the preschool. The little shanties that the gentleman was talking about down the road, I used to live in one of those 4-room houses across from Pinckney's Inn with no running water. We did have electricity, no running water, and outhouses. When Bonnie said overcomers, I said, I'm proud to be a lineage of the overcomers. African Americans are usually viewed as lazy, incompetent, so on and so forth. But we are very strong, hardworking, resilient, intelligent people who know how to figure things out to survive. No matter how big the anchor may be put around our neck, we find a way to pull it, to drag it, and to overcome and to survive. And many of us have had that poured into us through the struggle of our parents. Many who came here, my dad jumped on the back of a migrant truck having a temper tantrum because he got upset with his parents at home. I think he regretted that after, he got here and saw what it was really like. But he still overcame. Still overcame. They raised 5 children. They educated 5 children. We're all doing well. We all give back to our community on some level. So as dark as those times were for our relatives, I appreciate them. I appreciate every struggle, every sacrifice that they made because Bonnie, Miss Helen, so many in here are products of what we really are and what we can be. And that has been planted in us. Bonnie is planting it in her son. I'm planting it in my child. And so many of you. We are overcomers because of them. And this really, I had to come because I knew the struggle from a personal level, but I had to know more. So thank you for sharing. I thank my mother for telling me that snippet of history, because as Bonnie says, they don't like to talk about it. They don't like to talk about it, and we have to pull it out of them because it then lets them know how much higher we have to carry that torch to be overcomers. Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other questions, comments? Yes, come, please.
I have to wipe my tears off now. At one point, I thought I was going to have to leave because I was so emotional. And I came here to hear what you had to say and realized you came to our story like I knew all of that stuff from here. I worked at the grader one day. I went to the camp. I know the despair. I had the option to not be there, but I knew how very devastating. I know Graveyard, and his daughter had 3 kids. Like, this community is the epicenter. Like, this is the spot for all of that. I didn't see a lot of it in there, but yeah, it's deep right here where you are. There's all of that. And I was just overwhelmed for the same reason, like the pain. But look where we are now, what we have now, when this church was on Corwood Street, when the camps were riddled with drugs and violence. When you go to the grader, and I went there because I was like, oh, cash money? That's what I was thinking, oh, you get cash? And then when I came there in my cute little outfit, it was hard, it was dirty, it was dangerous. And I only worked like 4 hours. So imagine if this was your lifestyle. That's what breaks my heart. But then I'm proud, then I'm proud. I thought I was gonna hear your story, and you reminded me of our own. So you need to come sit down with these people for the next version. And Ms. Brenda brought some history too. But thank you.
Fantastic. Yes. I'm going to ask that you would take the mic to her. Yes. Can you raise your hand again? Yes, there you go. Mm-hmm.
Hi. I just want to echo on what Bonnie said. Sitting here, I went from You know, I came as an informational thing. I just wanted to hear what you were going to say about the migrant history here. But we lived it. My family weren't migrant workers, but we lived here during that time when the migrant workers were here. And it's true, they were isolated. They were separated. And it's almost like, as we grew up, like there were townspeople and then it was them. And there were people who felt like we had our own things about, you know, don't go to the grader because there's crime there, or it's, you know, you're gonna get robbed, or they're gonna do that. And then you met them, and you're like, they're us, they're people. They were just struggling. And a lot of them were young kids. They were teenagers. They were young kids working in the grader. You met them and they're like 16 and 17 and 18 and 20. And the conditions that they were living in, the conditions that they were working in. And you know, First Baptist Church of Bridgehampton is my church, is my church home. I don't live in Bridgehampton anymore, but I grew up in Bridgehampton, graduated from Bridgehampton High School, and they used to come to Bridgehampton Church. And a lot of them came to the church. I don't know if they joined because I was young during that time, but I know they came. And they came in whatever they had. They came in whatever they owned, because Black Baptist churches back then, times have changed. But when you came to church on Sunday, you came in your Sunday best when you came to church on Sunday. And when they came as a youngster, I know sometimes the choir would bust into that song, no, Just As I Am, because we accepted everybody in this church just as I am. And as a youngster, we didn't realize, to the extent that I realize now, what they were going through. But I can tell you that it was the community, it was the Black community, the Bridgehampton Child Care Center. As the young lady that stood up before, I went as a child. When we became teenagers, we became counselors. We worked at the Bridgehampton Child Care Center. You know, now we're gone, but the community and the Black people here who didn't really have much themselves reached out, and we had a relationship with the migrant workers, because the government did nothing, the council people did nothing. It was like they were nothing. They were treated like nothing. But as I said, Black people are very resilient. You know, it's like they can't hold you down but for so long, because we just keep moving. And I didn't know it was even that widespread, as you're mentioning it now, but yeah, we lived it. And we never had it presented this way. And it's good to see that people are talking about it now, because as the pastor said, not too much has changed. It's my understanding that even today, they're still bringing in people from Jamaica to work at King Cullen and busing people in to work in these stores, because they're not paying the wages out here that can afford. I don't know how somebody can work at CVS and get paid $15 or less than $15 an hour and live anywhere in Suffolk County. And I don't even know how you do it. I don't know how you do it. So the cost of living, the cost of wages out here are not commensurate with the area. So even though we've come a long way, we still have a long way to go.
Thank you.
You want this? Okay. I have to put a sanitary cover on it.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Have to say thank you to the author. I am so enamored with with what you presented, because this is what is missing. I came here not too long ago, so I don't know about the camps and those things, but I know the story. I've heard the story. And I must say that we're going back to that state because now you cannot get anywhere to live as a worker in this community. If you work for a business, you can't live anywhere. You probably might have to live on the street shortly. Now, I noticed that one or two sensible business people have bought houses on the turnpike to make sure that they have workers for their business in Sag Harbor and in Bridgehampton. You probably know about it. I am wondering, where is the political, where are the people who are supposed to be providing housing, affordable housing? Because you look and you see every morning, if you have to head west, the bumper-to-bumper traffic coming in to work. These are all workers, and if they have to get a house someplace, it's going to be like 10 of them living in one house. It still exists. So I thank you, because that is why I have to open my mouth now, because it continues. Thank you.
Hi again. I'd just like to say that my husband's father, Alec Pinkney, was the crew leader and boss at A.C. Carpenter in Watermill, and he and his wife, they ran the potato house and the labor camp. And there were things going on, but you know, that's how things are. But they were fortunate enough to work hard and then buy an establishment, build an establishment on Sag Harbor Bridgehampton Turnpike called Pinkney's Inn, and ran it for over 30 some odd years. And they did buy property across the street and build housing, rental housing for people that needed houses. And also, a dear friend of ours and a friend of our church, Gloria Harris, on the Turnpike, was able to buy a piece of property from Alec Pinkney because they had property that they bought up. So, and then also my father, at one point, Rufus Hobson Sr., ran A.C. Carpenter, not A.C. Carpenter's, I Am Young labor camp here in Bridgehampton. And then there were Maddie and Joe Roberts, who ran labor camps and potato houses. And again, there could have been some things going on that maybe shouldn't have been, but they were trying to work hard to get what they got to. And they were able to buy property and build housing here too. So I just wanted to say that.
We have a couple of more. We'll begin to wrap up a little bit. I know our seat time is sensitive as we're wearing masks, so we don't want you all to suffocate too much longer.
Hi, thank you. I'd just like to support what Sister Brenda said. My name is Helen Smith, and I don't know about the camps other than when I was young, as I think it was said you don't go over there, you don't deal with them, and so forth and so on, because of the violence and things weren't so good. But my grandfather, Maynard Square, was from Portsmouth, Virginia, and he would come up seasonally and pick potatoes and so forth and so on, make his money, and go back and take it to his farm. And that's how he then raised his family, then eventually came up after doing that for a number of years, and came up and also bought property. And he and my uncle, they were able to buy a lot of land as well. But they were, I guess it was almost like sharecroppers, or worked the farms and seasonal work and things like that. And I never heard stories about what went on at the camp or anything like that, but I do know they worked hard. I know they left their families, and then went back and worked their farms there and came back. So that's another history that many of us have grown up with as well. And then they eventually settled up here. So that's how you have a lot of people from North Carolina, Virginia, and so forth and so on who have settled locally and did fairly well and able to buy property and try to help one another and different things like that. And that's a legacy that we have to also mention. Thank you.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, oh, yes. Thank you.
I just want to say that I, too, am a product of the Bridgehampton Child Care Center. Probably not too many of us are left that were in Dr. Desmond's old office when they started the Bridgehampton Child Care Center. But my father worked on a farm. We didn't come up as migrant, but he worked on a farm. My mother did domestic work, and she was very happy to have a place for my brother and myself to be safe and secure while she was at work. And actually, if I remember, that's where my brother met my late sister-in-law, because we were all, her parents brought her to the child care center as well. But again, I've just found that it has morphed into such a wonderful, wonderful facility. But again, I'm a product of the Bridgehampton Child Care Center, my brother, and many others, and we're just so thankful that that opportunity arose, not just for migrant workers, but for families, for people who wanted to go out and work and wanted a safe place for their children. And I applaud Bonnie and everyone involved with the Child Care Center now, because as time has progressed, the needs have changed. Not just a place for children to be taken care of, but a place to nurture and grow and encourage and help them to be even the best selves that they can be. And again, it's a wonderful, wonderful facility, and I just thank you.
Again, this has certainly been amazing, enlightening, touching. I'm going to bring it. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say, if you don't get emails from the center already, please leave your email address here and your name, especially the alumni, because we will be having a grand opening, of the new building, a ribbon cutting, and we really want as many alumni as possible to come and see what the center is today. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Again,
And there will be a book signing afterwards.
Yes.
Sorry.
So we are just so grateful that you all were able to come up. We have one more? Okay.
Well, I'm just saying one more thing. My niece is a product of the center, and she is, what should I say? She's so grateful for the opportunity she got to be at that center. And today, Bonnie, you probably know where she is now and what she's doing. So please make sure you get all your students back, your past students, because it tells a story, wonderful story, victory.
Awesome. And so the haven, the happy people come here for holiday, but today we had to explore the horror. We cannot ever gloss over some of the darker sides of our area in favor of the great part. And today we learned how we move from labor camp to luxury. And most of the story, when you hear the Hamptons, all anyone thinks of is the luxury of this area, with little regard for those who are here all the time and upon whose backs the Hamptons was built. And so we ought never forget them. We always want to honor them. That this is part of our history. History is good and it's bad, but it's our history. And thank you all for being better angels. And thank you all for being lions. You are now the lions that tell the story. I'm going to give Mark one final word, and then I'd like you to come back, Bonnie, for your final remarks. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to say here at the First Baptist Church of Bridgehampton, it's an honor to be in partnership with the center. It is an honor to have met you and host you today. And if there's anything that we can do to further facilitate events like this, we are in. And let me say this last thing. As the pastor of this church, I have to do this. We would say at this point, right? Deaconess Pinckney, we'd open the doors of the church. But since this is not a religious event, I do have to say this. One of the running themes that I heard was the lack of inclusion, that they were them and we were us. But let me say here, there's a place for everybody here. There's a place for everybody here. We are not a us versus them church. And I'll say that there are no big I's and little U's in this church. We follow the model of Jesus, who one day decided to have one final supper. You all know it as Holy Communion. And Jesus sat at a table serving all manner of disciples who came from every walk of life, from an accountant to lowly cursing fishermen. And as he sat at that table, everything was happening at that table. There was jockeying for position at that table. There was deception at that table. There was sin at that table. There was great love. Anything you could imagine was happening at that table. But here's what Jesus did. He never left the table. He stayed at the table. And the reason he stayed at the table was so all of us could have a place at that table. So I want you to know you have a place here. There is no us versus them. And so I'm going to ask Mark to have his final remarks, and then we're going to call Bonnie up to close us out. Thank you all for joining us today.
What can I say? I'm quite moved, more than I knew I would be moved when I came here. Now I feel welcome as part of this community. Even though I live quite a bit away, it's wonderful to feel welcome, to have a place here, to share this history. And I'll end with one good note as well. For the longest time, I realized that this history is meant to teach, not just write. I'm proud to say that as of now, I'm being considered for an adjunct professor position at a university, Hofstra University, to teach this history. And it's a great honor to teach it and share it with the young minds growing up so they don't forget it. And I'll end with, I want to thank all of you who shared your personal experiences, because again, I'm quite moved to know that I did a small way, in some small way, did a good thing, but you all have done a great thing. So thank you all for sharing that, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's give our moderator and Mark Torres a hand. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say, I wanted to close out real quick and just say again, thank you, Reverend Tissue, the best, and Mark Torres. Wow. You know, everybody get the book, okay? Everybody get the book. Let's follow it. But one of the things that, I just wanted to reiterate that the center, you know, I've been there now for about 17 years now, actually. But there are many that came before me that made the center. And the center has been around for 70+ years. And you can see pretty much from those 70+ years, it is still standing. And it's standing because of the legacy of a lot of individuals that made this happen, a lot of individuals in this room, a lot of people's ancestors, and things of that sort. So I don't want you all to forget that, but what I want you to do also is to know about what is going on today. And we have, because on the backs of those folks, we have a 7,000 square foot building, new building there that is going to open, hopefully we'll do the grand opening in August. That's what we're looking at, a grand opening sometime in August or September. We will be in there in July because we have a summer program that's going to be happening in July. But it's a 7,000 square foot building that has a computer lab. It has a recording studio. It has multiple rooms, a conference room there. And then it's on 6 acres where we have our basketball court, our tennis court. And we have not only just the after school program and a food pantry there and emergency assistance, but we have college prep there, SAT prep, college coaching there. We have a brand new, when we talk about the wealth equity, we have a brand new program called Teach Me How to Fish, where we are taking individuals through a software engineering boot camp, making them software engineers so they can get careers and better wages, going into the real estate industry, going into the trades. There is so much that we're doing there at the center, and it's because we could not have done it without you all and those that have come before me. So I dare not stand up and take credit for everything, because the center is much more than just me. It's a lot of people that made that center happen, and the center stands, and there's a lot of love in this community, a lot of people that have given to this center, and I want to just acknowledge that. And I thank you all for coming today. I thank you, First Baptist of Bridgehampton. I thank this community, and we'll be having more talks. I thank some of my board members that are here, and we have another talk that's going to be happening on July 22nd at the church in Sag Harbor. Ursula Burns, who is the first black female CEO, will be speaking at the church in Sag Harbor on that day. And we have some other things, Black Film Festival, other things, but just stay informed, get on our email list. And again, I thank you all. Thank you, thank you. God bless.